Dear students, today's lecture deals with the identification and understanding of barriers to effective communication. Effective communication is important not only in everyday life but also in business and building confidence in communicating in a cross-cultural communication environment. It is important to overcome various forms of hindrances in communicating effectively. Communication is one of the most important aspects of our life today. This is due to the growing complexities in media, increased cross-cultural population and globalization. The new contexts and technologies made complex patterns for communicating with each other. This has been true with interpersonal communication, but with all types of communication. Barriers of communication or noise in communication is identified and acknowledged as one of the important components of communication process. The communication models have improved further from simple sender, message, channel and receiver to encoding, decoding, noise or redundancy and other types of elements which will contribute to make communication happen. Because communication will not take place in vacuum. There are some expectations from both sides of the sender and receiver. These needs to be understood and communication should facilitate. The lecture is aimed to identify different barriers to effective communication and suggest measures for effective communication. The subject expert is Dr. Krishna Sankar Kusuma, who is presently working as a Senior Assistant Professor at AJK Mass Communication Research Center of Jamia Millia Islamia, and I am Shivangi Anand. What is effective communication? The word communication comes from the same root as common and community. Communication can be defined as the process of exchanging messages between a sender and a receiver. It can be verbal, non-verbal, or it can even be an interpersonal communication or an intrapersonal communication. Effective communication means people have reached a shared understanding. The message is clear and made an impact. The effective communication in a business environment or organization will always bring positive attitude and favorable working environment. Effective communication should have 7 C's of communication. 7 C's of communication given by Cutlip in 1952 in his Effective Public Relations, much quoted words in an explanation on the communication process. These are useful for effective communications which are applicable to both written as well as oral communication. These are as follows. First, completeness. Second, conciseness. Third, consideration. Fourth, clarity. Fifth, concreteness. Sixth, courtesy. Seventh, correctness. Awareness of these 7 C's of communication makes you an effective communicator. Barriers to communication. A communication barrier is anything that prevents you from receiving and understanding the messages others use to convey their information, ideas, and thoughts. These barriers may be related to the message, internal barriers related to thoughts and feelings, or external barriers. Types of barriers to effective communication. Ellis and Thorio in 2004 outlined how barriers to communication can occur at every stage of the communication process. Ellis and Thorio discuss a series of barriers from the perspective of communication process. This includes the elements like sender, message, channel, receiver, feedback, encoding, decoding, and context. Sender and receiver. Barriers can occur in either the sender or the receiver and can include psychological barriers like being inattentive to the sender, physical barriers within the sender or receiver like being tired or stressed, past experiences or culture of the sender or receiver, prejudices held by the sender or receiver, encoding and decoding. According to Stuart Hall, it is the set of decoded meanings which have an effect, influence, entertain, instruct and persuade with very complex perceptual, cognitive, emotional, ideological or behavioral consequences. In a determinate moment, the structure employs a code and yields a message. At another determinate moment, the message via its decoding issues into the structure of social practices. These barriers surround the interpretation of the message. Perhaps some of the words used aren't clear. The sender or the receiver may use slang that the other participants do not understand. Participants may hold different meanings about certain concepts or words used. Message. Some messages are difficult to listen to, some are culturally insensitive, and some can be very complex and difficult to understand. Unclear messages means in terms of meaning, grammar and words, which may act as a barrier to communication because the receiver may not be able to intercept the actual meaning of the message. Stereotypes. According to Funk and Wagnalls, stereotypes are beliefs or generalizations about characteristics or qualities that are felt to be typical of a particular group. Stereotyping is a barrier to communication because people with stereotype thoughts either will not read the message completely or will not read it at all because of their thinking that they already know everything. Channel. The channel can inhibit many barriers. Choosing the right channel for each communication is important. Effectiveness of message also depends on the channel. Many people understand instructions better if they are written than if they are given orally. Vocal barriers often occur like speaking too softly. Feedback. Feedback is an important part of effective communication but can also harbor barriers. Feedback helps to improve the communication further. Communication should not be one-sided. Feedback completes the communication process. Barriers can occur if feedback is limited, inappropriate, and/or received in an ineffective way. Context. The context of communication is susceptible to many barriers. The physical environment may be too hot, cold, or noisy. Certain contexts require special protocols. If one participant does not understand these protocols, barriers to communication can occur. There are many reasons which make a message more complex and create confusion. In an organization, to meet the time-bound tasks and other reasons end up in miscommunication. It will affect the relation among the employees of an organization as well as with other organizations. Some of the barriers are of communication which will be barriers for effective communication are as follows. First, physiological barrier. Second, semantic and language barriers. Third, socio-psychological barriers. Fourth, organizational barriers. Fifth, cross-cultural barriers. Sixth, physical and environmental distractions. Physiological barrier. Physiological barriers to communication are related with the limitations of the human body and the human mind, that is the memory, attention and perception. Physiological barriers may result from individuals' personal discomfort caused by ill health, poor eyesight or hearing difficulties. Noise. Noise can disrupt the flow of information between any of these 5 stages, that is to say, issues in communication pertaining to distraction could affect the sender, the message itself, the channel it is being sent through, or the recipient of that message. Communicative interference. Every organization faces certain barriers to communication. Shannon and Weaver argue there are 3 particular layers of communication problems. Technical. How accurately can the message be transmitted? Semantic. How precisely can the meaning be conveyed? Efficacy related. How effectively does the received meaning affect behavior? These layers relate to a variety of types of noise that can interfere with communication. Environmental noise. Environmental noise is noise that physically disrupts the communication, such as very loud speakers at a party or the sounds from a construction site next to a classroom. Physiological impairment noise. Physical conditions such as deafness or blindness can impede effective communication and interfere with messages being clearly and accurately received. Semantic noise. Semantic noise refers to when a speaker and a listener have different interpretations of the meanings of certain words. For example, the word weed can be interpreted as an undesirable plant in a yard or as euphemism for marijuana. Syntactical noise. Communication can be disrupted by mistakes in grammar such as an abrupt change in verb tense during a sentence. Organizational noise. Poorly structured messages can also be a barrier. For example, a receiver who is given unclear, badly worded directions may be unable to figure out how to reach their destination. Cultural noise. Making stereotypical assumptions such as unwittingly offending a non-Christian person by wishing them a Merry Christmas can also detract from communication. Because of this, it is important that each side of a conversation understands the culture of the other party. Psychological noise. Certain attitudes can also make communication difficult. For instance, significant anger or sadness may cause someone to lose focus on the present moment. By acknowledging and adjusting to noise, a communicator can make it more likely that their message will be received as intended. Time and distance. Time becomes a physical barrier when people have to communicate across different time zones in different countries. The physical distance between people who need to communicate can also cause problems because it does not allow oral or face-to-face communication. If a message is not sent in appropriate time, the message will not have the effect that it should have, as the intention will not be met. This causes barrier in communication. So, the time of the message should be accurate. The person from Asia will not be able to Skype a person in US if the time zone difference is wrong and the second person is sleeping. Likewise, the geographical distance also affects the message. Distance adds more requirements and barriers to communication. As greater the distance, the more technical channels are needed. The sender and receiver need to include machines as mediums, encoding, decoding, etc. Face-to-face communication has the least physical communication barrier and are easier as there are more communication channels. New technologies are being made to reduce noise in the mediums and channels. In all, advantages and disadvantages of different mediums must be analyzed for different distances before using one. Defect in medium of communication. Defects in the devices like telephone, postal system, failure in electronic medium, etc. also create physical barriers as in a faulty fax machine or typewriter. Similarly, a computer that hangs or a dead telephone line can lead to non-transmission of messages. Example, no range in mobile, technical problem in mic or speakers. When two people are communicating over the telephone, there is a chance for disturbance for the communication between them. The receiver wouldn't take the proper message from the sender, which acts as the communication barrier. Poor listening skills. Many people are poor listeners even in everyday life. They tend to listen and think about something else at the same time. This happens even more frequently when people are in conflict. Rather than carefully attending to what the other person has said, many people think about the response while the other person is talking. In addition, they tend to interpret things to coincide with the views that they already have. For this reason, they assume they know and understand what other people are saying, because they assume that it corresponds to their own expectations about what the person is likely to say or should be saying. Since people in conflict tend to develop hostile and distrustful images of the other, their interpretation of things the other side says or does is also likely to be hostile and distrustful. Ambiguous messages are interpreted in the worst possible way. Even clear messages tend to be ignored or disregarded if they are inconsistent with one's original negative view. Such poor listening makes good communication almost impossible. No matter how much care one person or group takes to communicate their concerns, values, interests, or needs in a fair, clear, unthreatening way, if the listener is not willing to receive that information in that way, the communication will fail. Information overload. If too much new information is fed to the receiver, he or she will be unable to take it in. It is necessary for the sender, therefore, not only to mix new information with old, but also to break the information down into small chunks, just as a mother breaks food down into small bite-sized morsels for her baby. Inattention. At times, if the students are attentive to the teacher, they may fail to understand what the teacher is delivering in the class. Hence, the inattentiveness also causes as a barrier to the communication. We sometimes do not listen but only hear. Emotions. Emotion plays a very important role how we receive a message. The same message can be interpreted in different ways when we are angry and when we are in a normal mood. Emotional state causes some physiological changes in a body that may affect the pronunciation, pressure of the speech and tone of the voice of the sender, as well as the perception, thinking process and information interpretation of the receiver during verbal communication. Semantic barrier and linguistic barriers. Lack of common language. Language barriers are the most common communication barriers which cause misunderstandings and misinterpretations between people. Most of the people in the world do not speak English, or even if they use, it is the second or third language. If the speaker and receiver do not use same language and words, there is no meaning to the communication. Not using the words that other person understands makes the communication ineffective and prevents message from being conveyed. Difference in language. Difference in language is the most obvious barrier to communication, as two people speaking two different languages cannot communicate with each other. For example, an American goes to China. The person does not understand Chinese and most people in China do not understand English. So, when the person speaks, the communication is worthless as the other Chinese person doesn't understand it. The accents and the dialect of people belonging to different places differs even if their language is the same. Though the languages are technically the same in people using different dialects and accents, the meanings, implications and interpretations of words are different, which may lead to various kinds of conflicts. For example, if a Scottish farmer talks to a person from London, they do not understand most of the words the other says even though they both speak English. The word ham and bacon can be used interchangeably in Scotland, but they are different in England. For example, the abbreviation LOL used in chat language used to mean lots of love before, which changed to laugh out loud. If a person says LOL, the second person can interpret the meaning in any way they want or from their understanding. People use both the abbreviations according to the context and need. Poor vocabulary. The choice of word used in describing anything must be considered before communicating. The words used by a particular person to show their agreement on something can be taken as sarcasm, which is negative in nature. Words with two meanings, homonyms, homographs, homophones, should always be avoided as it doesn't send the proper meaning and can be interpreted in any way. So, the message will not be sent as intended, which acts as a type of language barrier in communication. The person may have access to a limited vocabulary and may not have the words he or she need to communicate a message. The person may be unfamiliar with the vocabulary available to him or her, as it cannot be assumed that he or she knows all the words in his or her communication display or device. Poor knowledge of grammar and punctuation. Grammar and spelling becomes a barrier in communication as people from different parts of the world can be using it differently even in a particular word. Similarly, grammar and spelling mistakes create a huge communication barrier in written communication. There are many other causes too, like language disabilities, noise, distance or use of metaphors or similes, which can be included in other barriers like psychological and physical. Some language barriers can be overcome with practice or other ways like translation, interpreter, language classes, visual methods, etc. Whereas some barriers act as problems in a person's whole life. These barriers must not be present to make the communication effective. Language, jargon, slang, etc. are some of the semantic barriers. Different language across different regions represent a national barrier to communication, which is particularly important for migrating nurses. Use of jargon and slang also act as barrier to communication. Individual linguistic ability may sometimes become a barrier to communication. The use of difficult or inappropriate words in communication can prevent the people from understanding the message. Poorly explained or misunderstood messages can also result in confusion. The linguistic differences between the people can also lead to communication breakdown. The same word may mean differently to different individuals. Communication breakdown occurs if there is wrong perception of the meaning of the message by the receiver. Socio-psychological barriers. Social barriers to communication include the social psychological phenomenon of conformity, a process in which the norms, values and behaviors of an individual begin to follow those of the wider group. Social factors such as age, gender, socio-economic status and marital status may act as a barrier to communication in certain situations. Psychological factors such as misperception, filtering, distrust, unhappy emotions and people's state of mind can jeopardize the process of communication. We all tend to feel happier and more receptive to information when the sun shines. Similarly, if someone has personal problems such as worries and stress about a chronic illness, it may impinge his or her communication with others. Organizational barriers. Unclear planning, structure, information overload, timing, technology and status difference are the organizational factors that may act as barriers to communication. Technological failure. Messages are not delivered due to technical failure. For example, due to bad network delivery of short messages might take too long to reach from sender to receiver. This will also act as barrier. Time pressures. Often in organization, the targets have to be achieved within a specified time period, the failure of which may have adverse consequences for the employee. In a haste to meet deadlines, usually an employee tries to shorten the formal channels of communication that can lead to confusion and misunderstanding among the various levels of supervisors, hence leading distorted communication. Therefore, sufficient time should be given for effective communication. Complexity in organizational structure. Greater the hierarchy in an organization, more the number of managerial levels, more is the chances of communication getting destroyed. Only the people at the top level can see the overall picture, while the people at lower level just have knowledge about their own area and a little knowledge about other areas of the organization. Cross-cultural barriers. Culture shapes the way we think and behave. It can be seen as both shaping and being shaped by our established patterns of communication. Cultural barrier to communication often arises when individuals in one social group have developed different norms, values, or behaviors to individuals associated with another group. Cultural difference leads to difference in interest, knowledge, value, and tradition. Therefore, people of different cultures will experience these culture factors as a barrier to communicate with each other. Physical and environmental distractions. Physical distractions are the physical things that get in the way of communication. Examples of such things include the telephone, an uncomfortable meeting place, and noise. These physical distractions are common in the hospital setting. If the telephone rings, the usual human tendency will be to answer it even if the caller is interrupting a very important or even delicate conversation. Distractions such as background noise, poor lighting, uncomfortable sitting, unhygienic room, or an environment that is too hot or cold can affect people's morale and concentration, which in turn interfere with effective communication. how to overcome the barriers of communication. It is very difficult to suggest a comprehensive list of vital features of systems of communication. It will depend on the specific needs of the situation. The following guidelines or principles may be followed to achieve effective communication. Clarity of message. The basic principle in communication is clarity. The message must be as clear as possible. No vagueness should creep into it. The message can be conveyed properly only if it is clearly formulated in the mind of both the sender and the receiver. Speed. A good system of communication must ensure a speedy transmission of message. The time taken to transmit a message to its destination and speed of the communication system should be considered on the basis of the urgency of communicating the message. If message is not delivered at the time, it creates problem for organization. Two-way process. Communication is the two-way process that provides feedback to the sender from the receiver. Feedback refers to transmission of information concerning the effect of any act of communication. Reliability. Communication starts on the basis of belief. This atmosphere is built by performance on the part of the expert. The receiver must have confidence in the sender. He must have a high regard for the source's competence on the subject. Completeness. Every communication must be complete as adequate. Incomplete messages create misunderstanding, keep the receiver guessing, and delay action. Content. The message must be meaningful for the receiver and it must be compatible with one's value system. It must have significance for him. In general, people select those items of information which promises them the greatest rewards. The content determines the response of the audience. Accuracy. The communication medium should ensure accuracy in the transmission of messages. Whatever the medium chooses by the sender should be accurate for that particular kind of information which they want to send. Capability. Communication must take into account the capability of the audience. Communications are most effective when they require the least effort on the part of the recipients. This includes factors like reading ability and receiver knowledge. Economy. The communication system should be as much economical as possible, but efficiency of the system should not be sacrificed to achieve economy. Secrecy. The communication system should ensure secrecy and there should be no leakage of information. It becomes more essential when messages are of confidential nature. Benefits of effective communication. Establishes professionalism. Better interpersonal skills will help in establishing professionalism in the organization. This will add to the other important elements of work like time management, hard work, knowledge of work, etc. Builds long-lasting relationships. In business, trust is more important. Better communication helps in building long-lasting relationships. Some of them include non-verbal cues such as tone, pitch, and intensity during communication. Any relationship will fare better if you speak in kinder and more understanding ways. There are some speaking cultures and some are talking and others are listening cultures. One must understand breeds trust. When you trust someone, you are able to rely on them and confide in them. You know that they will perform well if asked to work on a task. When meeting in person, it is easier to understand the body language and other visual cues of communication. It helps people to better understand each other and the message that's being conveyed. Managers have even shown preference to meeting in smaller groups of 1 or 2 people. This will improve the trust and performance. More friends and connections. Email, social media, phones and technology rule the world of communication. It's easy to get lost in the heap. But communicating face-to-face helps to establish friendships and connections regardless of the setting. In a book by the small talk expert Don Gaber, he describes how to communicate conversationally. He says, having open body language and being the first person to initiate conversation will help to foster relationships, making it easier to connect with friends, co-workers. Overcome obstacles. A common but often overlooked form of communication is expressing gratitude. Showing your appreciation makes the other person feel validated and valued. If you're having a hard time working with someone, make sure to thank them for their time and their efforts, even if you are frustrated. The action will have a deeper effect than you may realize. Higher engagement. When you are the leader, you want all of your employees to work hard all the time, but that's not realistic. Communicating with employees about work and non-work topics in meetings, face-to-face, or even over the phone has shown that employees are more involved in and enthusiastic about their workplace. They are committed to the company. I hope you like this session. Have a nice day. Take care and goodbye.